coming today to our panel for Door County Reads 2023. This is Reflections on Resilience and Trauma and Resilience. My name is Beth Locken. I'm the Youth Services Librarian for the Door County Library. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's website in a variety of forms. We were having some technical difficulties with our streaming. So let me do just a little bit of an introduction to Door County Reads. Today's program is not the only thing that's going on a few of the possibilities that are on these lovely little pieces. Tomorrow, it's Friday, February 3rd at 7 p.m. Third Avenue Playworks will be doing Murder Girl by Heidi Armbruster. On Saturday at 1 p.m. at the Sturgeon Bay High School Auditorium, we will be having our author, who is Andrew Groff, come and talk about Raft of Stars. That one should stream, and and one should be streaming as well as recorded, as well as in person. So please come on down to the Sturgeon Bay High School Auditorium for that. There are a couple of different wonderful programs coming up at Crossroads at Big Creek on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. And for more, you can absolutely check on our website or in paper. So our panel today includes Jodi Rose Gonzales, whose list of alphabet after her is very long. ATRNCCERYTYACEP. Jodi Rose Studios. Thank you very much for coming. Millie Gonzalez is stuck in an airport somewhere, so even though she is on the list, she will not be here with us today. We will miss her, but we have other wonderful people. Next person in line is Rebecca Nicholson, the community coordinator for the Door County Partnership for Children and Families. We have Helen Bacon, who is Sturgeon Bay City Alderperson. Thank you. She wears so many hats. So Sturgeon Bay City Alderperson, she is our mediator for our group today. We have Dori Goddard, MSW, from Child Protection and Youth Justice. She is the manager. And we have Sarah Perzycki, the mental health case manager for Door County Health and Human Services Comprehensive Community Services Program. So, ladies, thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you. And we'd like to thank the audience for coming and seeing us, and anybody out there. I think one of the things we had talked about when we met as a group was we'd like to have questions held until the end, if that's possible. If you really don't understand something that's being said, wave your hand. To start out, because this is on trauma and resilience, I thought I would ask Dori if she could give us a definition of trauma and intergenerational trauma, which is something else we'll be talking about.
All right. So trauma is a stressful event that may have occurred in somebody's life. There's different types of traumatic events. It could be an individual event. It could be something chronic that happens repeatedly over time. It could be a distressing event, and it causes an emotional response to this event that has a negative impact on a person or a group of people. Individual trauma includes physical harm, emotional harm, and/or life-threatening harm. An event or circumstance has lasting adverse effects on the individual's mental health, physical health, emotional health, social well-being, and/or spiritual well-being. There are many types of trauma. There's acute trauma, which is a singular traumatic event. Medical trauma, which is a psychological or physiological response to an event related to a medical condition. Secondary traumatic stress is a secondary response to trauma in somebody else's life. So as social workers, we're working with people that have experienced chronic traumatic events in their lives. And so the social workers may experience what's called secondary traumatic stress from that. Intergenerational trauma, which I know Helen wanted me to specifically bring up. Intergenerational trauma is a very interesting topic. There's a lot more research going on about it. They're doing research on DNA and epigenetics, and they're finding out that people who have experienced trauma, that their offspring are showing marks on their DNA that are associated with their parents or grandparents' traumatic events in their lives. And there's also muscle memory. So if people have traumatic events and their muscles have memories, and so that can get passed down from generation to generation. And that is really, if you ever want to dig into that intergenerational historical trauma, it's very fascinating. And I know some of the intergenerational trauma is talked about, is related in the book. We might have some discussions about that.
Jodi Rose Gonzales, could you tell us what your definition or what the definition of resilience is?
Sure. I looked up this morning the technical definition of resilience, which stated ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. I often say it simply as our ability to bounce back in the face of a challenge. There are different factors involved in resilience. Everyone has a unique set point for resilience. It can be inherited traits, past experiences, the amount of emotional support and emotional safety that we experience or feel, and also our mindset. We all have a unique resilience zone. That is what we can, how much we can take. And that changes depending on situations, but we have the ability to expand our resilience zone by learning to adjust to discomfort, to take on challenges, to increase the types of supports that we have. And likewise, when we withdraw from the world and from experiences, our zone of resilience can narrow. So it's a flexible, unique thing that we all have, and that changes.
Yeah. Well, there will be no, I guess we all read the book and we all kind of developed our own opinions of it. And I know when we met together, I asked people to kind of read the book, look at the book in terms of their particular work and their interpretation then of what they were reading. There will be spoiler alerts, so if you haven't read the book, too bad, too sad. But the obvious relationship in the book related to trauma, the one that I think it would be easy for everyone to see, is that of the violent relationship that Jack Bredwin has with his son Dale, also known as Bread. The other characters in the story have also experienced trauma in different ways, and I think specifically of Teddy Branson, also known as Grandpa, Fish's grandfather, who was a Korean War vet. Tiffany grew up poor and not well taken care of as a child. As a young adult, she was abandoned by her mother, left with her mother's debt, specifically the house mortgage. She ended up homeless, living in a tent, hungry, and stuck in a small town with no future. Sheriff Cal also grew up with a father who pushed him to be a man, not cry or be seen as weak. He talks about his father's voice in his head and that the voice made decisions for him. But then we also have positive characters, although nothing is black and white. So you think of Fish as being a positive character, although I often thought in reading this book, what are the trauma would he be experiencing from, at first he thought killing Brett's father, turns out only wounding him, but the whole act of shooting someone is very traumatic. His grandpa, Ted Branson, who obviously had some ways of dealing with his PTSD, but also was a very positive figure in the book. And then his mother, Fish's mother, Miranda, I think of them as positive characters. So what we're going to do is maybe give each person a chance to answer some general questions, and then we'll come back and maybe do another round. But Dori, the characters in the story have experienced trauma in different ways. How do you think their experiences affected their responses to the boys? And in talking about the boys, what were the character traits that Brett develops because of the violence? And I think I'd like you to talk a little about Brett and Fish and their relationship.
I think it was very interesting how Brett and Fish responded to the abuse that Brett was getting from his father, and how they, bonded together and made up stories to cope as a coping mechanism, and how they thought about different ways of killing Brett's dad, and just that bond that they created over that violence that Brett was experiencing. It also, again, as I mentioned earlier, secondary traumatic stress. Fish and his relationship with Brett was experiencing some of that secondary trauma through Brett. I feel like they obviously Fish was a positive support to Brett. Talking about the intergenerational, we can see throughout the storyline Brett having thoughts that he could have ended up like his father, and everybody in the other people in the stories, the characters in the stories reference that they expected him to turn out like his dad, and that does happen often. But the difference is Brett actually had some positive people in his life. And in the end, he also, got Tiffany and Cal, who are gonna take him further. So that really helped, balance that negativity and that impact of the abuse on him, balanced out with those healthy supports. So there is hope, and the key to experiencing stuff like that is to have supportive, healthy people in your life.
I wanted to ask you about the kind of character traits that Brett and other children like him develop. And then, in the book, Brett is a real outsider. He's an outsider at school or community. Tiffany's also an outsider at school. Do you see this often in the clientele that you work with?
Yeah, they tend to be either really isolate themselves. They'll isolate themselves. It could also be the opposite. They could be very gregarious and be very humorous and be the class clown. So you'll see both ends of the spectrum with that response, and they could end up being bullied and, become a bully. So those are some traits that we see in associating bread with, the work that my team does. But like, Jodi talked about earlier, it really depends on, personality and supports, and we all respond differently to situations. But yes, isolation and being loners, not wanting to make connections, keeping a wall up and building relationships, having superficial relationships. It was really great to read that Bread had that really close relationship with fish, because that was, I think, key to Bread's future. Tiffany, same thing. She had trust issues. She closed herself off, and she just didn't want to jump in and take that next step in building a relationship, because she's been, disappointed. Her needs hadn't been met. She had to make sure her own needs were met, the basic living needs, food, clothing, shelter. So, she really had some distrust in forming relationships, with Cal, and how that all worked out in the end.
So Sarah, you work with both youth and adults who have been traumatized and are struggling with the effects of trauma. How hard is it for children who have been traumatized to trust others and let others into their life?
I think, like Dori said, it depends on what protective factors are there. Like Bread has fish and his grandfather, so that there is people who believe in them. It is difficult. I think it's difficult for anyone to trust once you've been hurt. But then it goes back to the resilience, like Jodi was talking about too. It really depends on the supports that are in place for those kids, whether they're at home or in the community, at school, whether they have a church family, or we call those natural supports. So when those people are wrapping their care around the kid, it is much easier for them to become trusting. Some of these kids too, there's no routine in place. Kids need that routine. They need structure in their lives. And if their lives are chaotic, that structure is not there. I think of a youth that I'm working with now who is in a foster home. And when he first started with them, he had all the behaviors he would run. That was his big out, was to physically run away from the situation, whether it was school or home or therapy or programming. But over the course of the last 6 months, they have built structure into his life, and he's building these trusting relationships, and we're starting to see more emotional regulation. He is starting to trust, he's starting to feel safe, and that's the key, is whether or not these kids feel safe. If they don't feel safe, they're going to continue to isolate themselves or act out. A lot of kids that in school, they'll have these aggressive behaviors because they don't know what to do with the emotions, but they can't even sometimes identify what those emotions are, and it'll come out as anger. And so schools, unfortunately, often will isolate these kids too. And so they will put them aside, keep them separate from everyone else, or they'll say that these kids are manipulative. And I hate when people say that children are manipulative, because they're not. They're getting their needs met. It may not be the ideal way, or even make sense to adults, but they're getting their needs met. And that's the biggest part of it, is needs aren't being met, so they have to find a way to do it themselves.
So I also wanted to ask you, are there, now both of you work professionally, you work for the Department of Health and Human Services, and you work with children, some adults, but parents and children, et cetera. So what are some of the other things that can be done to break that cycle of violence?
It really comes down to the individual. And again, it's just whether they're feeling safe enough. But honestly, I think one of the biggest factors in recovery is other people believing in that person. If that person feels like, okay, maybe I am worth something and maybe it is worthwhile for me to make myself open to others, then I think healing is possible. I can say my own father was a victim of abuse and horrible poverty. And he decided himself, I'm not going to do this to my children. And he didn't. My dad has always been loving and supportive. He wanted us to have the childhood he didn't have. So he made that decision. Some people don't have that support. Again, he also had people who supported him, friends, parents who would let him stay with them, or the lady down on the farm by them, she would put him to work and she supported him and believed in him. And I think that's key. Whereas my grandfather did not have that. And then you add the trauma of being a vet from World War II, a prisoner of war, on top of all the trauma he already had been in. So, but he didn't have that support system around him. So he did not break that cycle. He continued that cycle. And you see that a lot, especially in families, like the historical traumas. You see it in Indigenous families, in families, Black families, Japanese families, Holocaust victims, those families, that's where, in fact, I think it was because of the Holocaust, the idea of intergenerational trauma first began being discussed, because they started to see that throughout, trickling down through the families.
I have one other question, that kind of relates to this, but the whole idea of therapy, recovery, that was a fairly new idea in the history of people. And what did people do before? Before they had the type of therapy, et cetera, available now. You don't know that the whole idea of trauma or trauma-informed care is a fairly new idea. What did people, in your professional opinions, what did people do?
Drink. Drink, alcohol, use drugs, continue the violence,
Not talk about it.
not talk about it.
Mhm.
And hopefully, like Sarah says, maybe there were a lot of good supportive people out there. So, we can easily talk about all the negatives, but we, do need to be fair in that historically people who experienced trauma, did have positive outcomes, and, support is, from my experience and what I've seen and observed and learned over the years, it really is that champion person for a victim. It's somebody or a group of people who are that victim's safe person, and it's their cheerleader, and it's their person they can go to feel safe. That to me, although there's other factors in having positive outcomes, that to me is the most important, is to have that supportive, positive person there for them.
I want to turn to this side of the table because I didn't ignore you guys. So Jodi, you work as one of the things that you do, one of the many things that you do is you work as an art therapist with children, often in the schools. I was going to ask you, so one of the themes I see in the book is one person helping another to succeed, which we've already talked about. I think of Miranda and Tiffany, and Miranda believes that Tiffany can do it, paddle, run the rapids, be successful in the woods, etc. And so what do you see your role as an art therapist working with kids? How does art come into that?
Well, this is a curveball question, Helen. And so I'm going to answer that sidewise. All good. I took some notes here because that's actually really this question, the belief that Tiffany has in Miranda. That's a big question. And there's a lot going on underneath the belief when you think about Miranda combing Tiffany's hair. The respect that Tiffany has for Miranda, these are attachment bonds that are forming that she didn't have, that are so necessary for children to learn to trust, to develop within their identities. And so the fact that Miranda believed in Tiffany was further empowered by the fact that Tiffany had respect for and an attachment bond forming with Miranda. So this is huge. And also there was the circumstance, it's like Tiffany needed to step up, like she knew she had to. So if we go back to this, I call it the zone of resilience. And so if the zone of resilience is here, it said like, positive change, consistent change, change that sticks happens when we put ourselves just outside of our comfort zone, little by little. If we're too far, if we put ourselves too far out, we experience panic and anxiety and emotional response. Sometimes life puts us there through a traumatic incident. Sometimes we just decide to speak in front of a group of people. So we use coping skills. We learn coping skills to bring ourselves back to the zone of resilience. The more that we do that, our zone increases. So in this case, belief and the emotional supports that the other women were talking to, this helps to make that outside of the resilient zone more palatable, more comfortable, and that reinforces the success, the belief in oneself that they can do it. So in working as an art therapist, we just do a lot of things that are attachment related, even if it's sitting on the floor doing, think of a mother, a parent and child playing on the floor, and just the simple things that reinforce, just simple techniques that reinforce the idea of connection, of being on the same level. We might work on the same piece together, literally getting on the same page, communicating back and forth non-verbally, which also happens in the early childhood relationships. So those are just a couple of examples.
What do you see as some of the healing themes in the book?
A lot. I have 8 bullet points, so I don't know that I'll talk to all of them, but the idea of witness was a really, really big one. Bessel van der Kolk is a very famous neuroscientist, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is one of, I think, the classic textbooks on trauma and trauma recovery. And he speaks to isolation, or the feeling that a person is alone in the experience, is a huge contributor to what becomes PTSD. I was thinking about this on the drive here today. He speaks to why didn't more people not have PTSD after 9/11? And he showed a picture of people walking across the Brooklyn Bridge, and he leans towards bilateral stimulation. So people were walking, so that had a soothing effect on the nervous system, that they were talking with each other about what had just happened. And many of them had loving homes to go home to. So even though, they all had these resilience factors, even though they all experienced or witnessed the same thing, they were in community and had these physical and interpersonal things happening. So that bread and fish witnessed each other. You know, and the witness happened throughout, but bread and fish, I think, witnessing each other through their own traumatic experiences. So fishes, you know, we saw fishes' traumatic responses like to the tornado where he just shut down. But bread was the strength there. And then at the end, as they're going up the river, when they make eye contact and they like saw each other, and everyone had witnessed each other in a new way and had been through this experience. So the idea of aloneness versus not aloneness is a huge healing theme. Also imagination and play, creativity. You see bread and fish, like they had this emotional moment at first along the river, and then they like suddenly they're warriors and they're playing, and that helped lift them out of their circumstances. The way that they decorated their boat and named their boat, all of these things help them again, like maybe widen their zone of resilience to cope. The kinesthetic aspects, so again, movement, I mentioned bilateral movement, they're running, they're processing stuff. So when we experience a stressful, not even traumatic, but stressful experiences, our bodies are cranking out hormones that, you know, movement, fight or flight response is a big, well, that's a natural response. So the fact that they could actually move and play and be physical. So as that relates in my work, I do the yoga work, breath work, walking. Oh my gosh, I have several youth that I work with that sometimes we just go for a walk and then we can sit down and get to what we need to work on. Connection with nature. There are just numerous studies. In my studio, I have like a 20-foot moss wall, and people come in and they go, oh, and they can smell the moss wall. There's an intention behind having that much nature in the space because it does bring us outside of the daily experience. It does spark imagination. It does take us out of our daily hamster wheel, so to speak. But there are numerous studies that show that nature, I just read across 11 countries, just listening to sounds of nature elevates mood, decreases symptoms of anxiety and depression. Bird sounds being, you know, one of the most effective. So they were immersed in nature, you know, and there's studies of awe as well. So being in nature and the awesomeness of what they're listening to, all of these things had soothing aspects on the nervous system to help work with the trauma response from the initial. We're talking about the shooting being the triggering incident in this case. That's what I'm responding to mostly in my response about healing here. And then also the servitude towards a cause larger than oneself or a purpose. That certainly motivated all the adults past all the stuff that they were going through. And so, and with the question with Tiffany, you know, Tiffany paddling, yes, she had Miranda's belief, but they also fully believed, and Miranda working past her broken arm, they all fully believed they were going to find those boys no matter what. And so I think, again, that relates to the aloneness. And Bessel van der Kolk also speaks towards if people are in trauma recovery, things like being in a church choir, volunteering in community, just being reminded that they're part of something larger than themselves has a healing aspect. So
I know you'd also talked about mindfulness. And what do you mean by mindfulness, and how does that relate to this story?
Thank you for bringing that up. I just thought it was notable. So mindfulness could be said as self-observation without judgment. Another fancy word for it is metacognition. So thinking about what you're thinking about. And so I like to sort of distinguish our knee-jerk emotional reactions, maybe yelling at the dog or yelling at someone just to be light about it. And then later realizing, well, that's not who I am or how I felt. I was just emotional in that moment. As helping professionals, we all help people develop skills to be able to think before they act. And so some really good examples of not mindfulness show up in the book. So like when Sheriff Cal, and he's all worked up about the horse, and is it Sheriff Cal? Did I get the name right? He's all worked up about the horse, and he says to Grandpa, you're under arrest. Certainly, that didn't even make sense. When Fish said, this is all your fault, on the river. And then when Tiffany threw the paddle, like, great, now we're really up the creek without a paddle. Teaching mindfulness is a big part in breaking the generational trauma cycle, like, so that we are less in survival mode, more in intention mode, and that brings us back to the recovery process. So, yeah, I just thank you for allowing the space to just talk about that briefly, because it's a big little point. So
Rebecca. I know in your work, you identify and work with folks, usually parents or teens, and you focus on referrals, but you also help to identify things and then refer people out.
Right.
So, you receive referrals from schools, other agencies, word of mouth. And would you like to tell our audience maybe some of the things that people are referred for? So these could be people that have seen Sarah and Dori, or not. They can be just your next door neighbor, etc. But what types of things are you referred for? What types of things are people? What types of things do people need to be able to reach that level of being able to move forward, I guess?
Sure. So just a little background. My role is a community connector, so I connect families with resources. And also any students that are K through 12 students, they may be 19, but because of having different abilities, they have not graduated high school yet. And so my job is to connect them with resources, help them feel comfortable connecting with those resources. And I'm able to do that because I have lived experience with utilizing many of the resources here in Dort County, for myself and also for the children that I've raised. And I say raised, I mean, you're always a mom. But my 3 oldest boys are out on their own, and I have 1 teenage daughter yet at home. So to answer your question, a lot of the referrals I get are for families struggling with primarily basic needs. So they're struggling to pay the rent or the utility bill. I've got, it's far and wide and, between. I also get a lot of referrals for families where the child is struggling at school or Boys and Girls Club or things like that. Like the parents are getting called frequently from the school staff that their children are unable to participate in class without being very disruptive to the other students. So I would then take those parents and I would speak, find out kind of what's going on, and then refer them out to service providers such as the CCS program or mental health therapists, Jodi through her art therapy program, things of that nature. Explaining more about what these programs offer, because I know, explaining from a parent's point of view, like how I feel they're valuable. I've also been able to walk hand in hand with a couple of parents that are just like, I don't want to call them myself. I don't know what to say. It's, I'm nervous. So then I will walk side by side with them, make the phone call together, get them introduced with an intake person or a therapist, and then kind of go from there. And usually then I phase out quite quickly. So just whatever they need, I try to help navigate how to get what they need.
And I wanted to ask you too, what do you think trauma affect some or all of these people that you work with?
I would say there is a very, very high percent of the people I work with having traumatic experiences in their background or having children that have experienced trauma. From what I have learned in my role and also getting extra training on trauma and things of that nature, we really can go back, whether it's mental health, illness, food insecurities, poverty, all of that, substance use and abuse links back to traumatic experiences in childhood. So yes, definitely the majority of who I work with probably have trauma in their background.
I also know that you've been involved in trauma-informed education and kind of a center person for that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And is it only for professionals? And
No. So trauma-informed care is really, people think of it as more like for professionals because it's kind of the way we interact with our clientele and that we meet them where they're at, and we come into the situation with some knowledge about trauma, how it affects individuals, so we can come and sit next to them rather than across from them in judgment. And that's hugely important for the success of that individual. But in just interactions with each other as a community, it's so important to understand that everybody has experiences in life. And incidentally, something that may have been traumatic to me, this, someone else could have experienced that same trauma or been in the same room when the trauma happened, but based on different aspects of life, genetics, resilience, where they're at in the resilience zone, things of that nature, it could affect me a lot worse than it could affect them. So there's a perception involved too. So it's really important as community members to even understand trauma and how to interact with others to promote resiliency as a community.
well, in the book, one of the themes is a result of one person believing in another. I'm thinking of Bread, Fish, and Fish's grandpa. They believe in Bread and help him. But one of the things that bothered me in the book was the reluctance of members of the community to reach out and help Bread. Pages. There are numerous examples in the book of citizens being aware of the violence that Bread experienced, but ignoring it. People are reluctant to report or get involved, and definitely on this end of the table. For example, Tiff understands because she herself was hungry and felt isolated and alone at school. Grandpa is quoted as saying, that Breadwin boy, he's a good boy. He tells Bread, I know how it goes if other people poke around in your business, how it can make it all so much worse. So if you ever need a place to go, you come straight over here. He then explains to Bread that his old man used to push me and my sisters around. But then after the boys have are on the run, he also says, I should have killed Bread's old man myself, which is violence begetting violence. It was probably a very, I guess, me say like back in the day when you didn't have other alternatives, that was an alternative. Sheriff Cal knew about Bread and his life with his old man, but was, his theory was you don't want to look too closely at it. And then as a young cop, he was taught that familiarity destroys authority and you can't be a friend. And that was, I think, something that was taught not only to cops, but in a lot of other professions. You were told to keep your distance from people. So I kind of want to ask each of you the same questions. Does belief in a person have an impact on our lives, on their lives? Most of us have grown up with people and parents we believe in. What happens if a person or a child doesn't have that person to believe in them? Jodi.
Sorry, I was thinking about the answer to the next question.
It takes a village to raise a child. I guess I'm trying to bring this back to the community.
Absolutely.
What is it that we, as community members, not just people who work in the field, but people, what can community members learn from this?
Well, I think that if you don't have someone believing in you, you're not going to, and someone reaching out for you, it's not modeled. It's not in your nature to even know that it's like a thing to do to reach out to help someone else. You repeat that isolation. My thought with the role of the greater community, I just wanted to tag off of both Dori's discussion of and definition of trauma, and then Rebecca is talking about trauma-informed care. In the middle of trauma and resilience are ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And there are measurements that just to take a step back, there are like 10 different types of ACEs, most of which Rebecca mentioned, which have to do with poverty, not having basic needs met, emotional, physical abuse, sexual abuse, having loss of a parent due to incarceration or otherwise. When there are 4 or more, that is also considered traumatic, and it has a huge effect on a child's brain development and ability to perform well. What I think that we're doing really well in this community is educating schools, educating people about what trauma is, and the trauma-informed care perspective is also assuming that people have had ACEs. So a child who is acting out in school previously or often has been labeled as, just having bad behavior, or, that's the bad kid. But now it's understood that there's a real biological relevance to their behaviors and that they're in a survival mode. So what that looks like on the teams that I'm with, not necessarily Sarah, but members of her colleagues with DHS, is that sometimes we look at if someone is struggling in school, rather than trying to put more boundaries and rules on them, we increase services so that they can learn to regulate better in school and therefore perform. So there's a whole different approach that we take as a community through the trauma-informed lens. And I think that is one of the very important roles, is to advocate and to make sure that we're questioning ourselves before just judging behaviors as people who respond to crisis type events.
Rebecca.
Okay, so I'm gonna speak from a little different angle on this one. So the question is around the importance of a person or child having someone that believes in them. And so I'm gonna give a couple of examples from my own experience in life and my children's experiences in life to help solidify how important it is. So growing up, my parents divorced when I was very young, and my parents both have widely varying personalities. So frequently I would be behaving and acting in things one way with my father versus my mother, and had different roles in the households in each place. And it was a confusing thing growing up. And I really struggled in high school, where, we really start to formulate who we want to be when we grow up, more so than when we're little. We have dreams of what we want to do. And I struggled a lot with direction on what where I wanted to be and things like that. And I had a choir teacher that really saw the talent that I had as a musical artist, and really, he would, I met with him in his office on a couple of occasions with just different life stuff that was going on. And it was really important to have him there as kind of outside of the household, someone who had a very unbiased opinion of me and what was going on. And that was huge for me. And I had friends that would pick on me about it, like, oh, you're in love with Mr. Poofall. It's like, no, that's not, whatever. But anyway, I didn't let that stop me still, having that relationship with him. When I look at my boys, I started parenting very young, and had some lack of skills in parenting or knowledge of parenting, as many young parents do. They don't come with manuals. You hear that all the time, and they don't. They're all different. One's completely different than the other. So through the years, I made several kind of, I would say not irresponsible, but I'll say impulsive choices in life and things like that. And was stuck in a caretaker role with many of my partners. So over the years, the boys were moved a lot. And so they really struggled with like making friends, because they didn't know how long they were going to be at this particular school or whatnot. But each of them had a little bit later in life, kind of like me in the high school years, an individual that was either always in their life or stepped in a higher capacity in their life that I think really helped them with their resiliency. And all three of them are way beyond where mom was at their age. So that has been, well, it's been awesome for me. And I've openly told them, I said, I don't take credit for where you guys are at now. I said, I mean, yeah, I have a little credit, but it's mostly, you guys, your resilience. And they kind of jokingly said back to me, but in all seriousness is very true. They're like, we just decided to, do things differently than the guys you were with. We didn't want to be those guys, So, but yeah, Blake went to Job Corps when he was in high school. So that was huge. He was put in a leadership role there. So, there was belief there. There was extra responsibility put on him, and he thrived in that. Marcus went and lived with his father in high school, and his father got him in boxing, and he did musical theater at his high school there. And then he enrolled in college after that. And Donovan also moved by his father. And I attribute a lot of Donovan's success actually to his father's now wife, who has children with autism herself, and Donovan has autism. He's high functioning, but without her life experience and knowledge at the table, I think that just helped him a lot. So now Ashlyn, who's she's at Sturgeon Bay, she's kind of followed in mom's footsteps with the musical aspect. So she's very big into choir, and she sees her choir teacher as a source of support, and really has seemed to kind of have that attachment bond happening here, which has been huge for her. And she does receive services through the CCS program. So we have a team around her. So that includes both natural and, the more professional supports. So that's huge. And she has me to believe in her. So I do my best to try to make a point to do things that she knows that I can be safe. So like, we both enjoy the singing. So I'll take her to karaoke, and we'll, I'll let her sing and shine and just nurture those things.
Thank you. Dori, I can repeat the question.
I also was in love with Mr. Poopall. Also had many discussions with Mr. Poopall.
I had no idea. You even went to that school. Cool.
Art crowd. You guys were both so eloquent. It's just really what I would like to say to all of you is that every one of us can make an impact. And I think every one of us can be that champion person for another youth, a child, or an adult even. And I think that's what's going to build the community, and just being aware. And I appreciate all of you coming here and just listening to this and spreading the word, and just being a support for somebody. The children out there really need us. And if you can at least touch the lives of some child and be their champion for them, I think it'll make a huge impact on them. There's so many stories out there. We had the Youth Connection Center that we were operating for youth that had delinquent behaviors, were truant, were expelled. And my story out of that is that the staff that we had at the Youth Connection Center built those relationships with the youth. And 5 of the youth that we had going there that were kicked out of school basically were able to return to the public school the following school year. And we had youth that were going there that would come there and say, this is my safe place. This is where I feel safe. And that says a lot about the connections that the staff made. And it's about the environment that we built there for the youth, because they were technically there as a consequence, but they actually wanted to be there. And to me, that just speaks volumes again, to the staff's relationship. They were those kids' champions. They were the ones that looked past the delinquent behaviors and realized that, you know, it wasn't the behaviors they needed to focus on. It was understanding that they had experienced trauma in their lives and they might not have had a safe home to go to. But that they were their safe person and their safe place to be.
Sarah.
No much more I can add to that. I think that as a community, it's important not to judge based on appearances, what you see. Because a lot of times people are written off because of circumstance. Well, that's Dale's, or not Dale, is Dad's name? Jack's kid. So it was assumed that Brett would grow up to be his father. And there are kids all over this community, all over this country who are brushed off. You know, they're just dismissed because they will never amount to anything. But any of those kids can amount to, any of us can. But again, it takes a community to be aware that those kids, rather than asking, you know, why did you do that? It's what happened to you? What made you choose that way to react if you made a choice? But I think it's best to assume that something happened to those kids and they are, you know, they're hurting. These are kids that are hurting and adults that are hurting because those kids grow up to be adults that are still experiencing that pain. That's really, I mean, it keeps coming back to the champion, being a champion, being an advocate. I think that's why any of us went into this field, is to advocate for other people in whatever area that is.
Okay, I have one more question at this end of the table here. So you guys spend your work days dealing with the breads of the world, which is the kids. I would assume that is the easiest half of the whole equation here, because you spend probably as much or more time working with their parents, who would be the bread's dad in this equation. And what does that do to, you know, people in your field? And what kind of, I know basically you said why you went into the field, you wanted to help people, but you get into the field, who then helps you? What can the community do to support people who are experiencing secondary trauma because of the people they work with? Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, yes, definitely. I'm the manager for, I don't know, a dozen staff, and it just breaks my heart when, you know, people question the social worker's decisions or my decision. And we hear often, why aren't you removing that child? Why aren't you putting them in foster care? How could you leave that kid there? We also hear the opposite. Why did you remove that child? That child should be home with their parents. And I would just ask that, know that we've had a ton of training. We have a ton of experience. We have statutes and standards and state guidance, and that we have to follow. And so it's really hard when we're already dealing with stressful situations to hear that from the general public and other professionals even at times. Just to know that we're doing the best we can. And my staff are amazing, amazing champions for the people they work with.
Sarah.
I think we lean on each other a lot. I think that there's also a bit of gallows humor. And you'll hear that
lot.
side laughing a lot. In fact, I gravitate towards that side of the office suite because it's easier to laugh about something than cry about it. And we've all done both, laughed and cried about situations that we faced. But I think the fact that we can all lean on each other and understand each other helps a great deal. And that's our natural support, is each other. So, and I agree with Dori. It's difficult when community members come up to us and say, well, why didn't you do that? Because that wasn't an option. Just trust us to do our jobs. And if we don't do something right, we will be the first to admit it and then learn from it.
Okay, so now we're kind of wrapping up here, but I want to ask each one of you, what impact did the book have on you and who was your favorite character and why? Jodi.
I just thought it was a beautifully written book. I loved the metaphors. I still don't understand all of them. It just was a rich, incredible book. So it was inspiring. I really saw it as much, if not more, as a book about healing. I love the metaphor of going down the river and back up the river. And so it just made me very reflective. And all of the characters were so relatable and accessible to me. I saw a little bit of myself in each one. So I don't really have a favorite. I do like Grandpa, because I'm just gonna say it, it's embarrassing, the old cowboy thing. But I loved his intentionality. I related to Tiffany so much. And just all of them were wonderful characters, and to see them all grow in their character development was just interesting. So definitely a recommended read for others.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the book, and agree with Jodi on, I liked how there was a lot of metaphors in there. I like how, well, when I read, I develop a movie in my mind. That's what I do. So it's like I could actually see this being a movie someday. I would be surprised if it wasn't, but I really liked how it was like there was excitement there, but then you could there was times when I actually cried because I could relate to the character or how they were feeling, especially at the end. When Bread's father is the one that actually showed up to try to save them. That was the guy with the hood over, so he jumps out of a hospital bed, right? And he's out on a river now, all bundled up with his rain gear and stuff, because he's determined to go save his son. I mean, that was pretty cool. But then at the end, I felt so horrible because now it's he's now risked his life to save his son, and his son was being a little twerp and cut down the buoy line so that, they were going to go over the falls, and his dad ended up dying. And that part was hard for me because it was that there's trauma in dad's life and nobody stepped in to do anything to help. And now he's gone. And then Fish tried to, when he was checking on him to see if he was still moving or still alive, but then the bear came up and basically said, get him, you get your butt in the cave, so you don't end up, dying or whatever. But that was all really hard for me emotionally. One thing I didn't care for with the book was that there was a lot of, and I know it probably was to help paint a picture, but I kind of got it after the first couple sentences. He did a lot of detailed description of a lot of things that I felt I don't know. I like to get to the point. So if there was one thing I could say to the author, it would be that, well, his imagery was portrayed very well. I don't know that he needed to spend as much time on it throughout the whole book.
You can ask him that.
I could.
Nature is another character.
Yeah. Yes. And he developed it a lot.
You're not going to believe this, Rebecca. But what came up, I read this over a couple weeks, and what came up in my head was somebody that impacted my life. And I always had feelings that I was never good enough, that I was always second best from little on. And I tried out for the swing choir in high school, which was like, you know, the cool choir, right? And it was my birthday, and the choir director called me out and off to the side, and he gave me this card. And I don't know if it was because I was reading this book that memory came back. I'm guessing it did, but in the card, it said, "Happy birthday. You made it into swing choir." And I mean, obviously, I remember crying, like, and it was Mr. Poofall. Of course. We gotta talk later. Yeah. But really, you know, Mr. Poofall built relationships with his students. And we felt his pain when his dog died and got ran over by a car. Like he just took that extra step to build relationship. Very professional, very boundaries, ethics, all that. But he just had a connection with the students, and that goes a long way.
So Mr. Poofall was your favorite character in the book?
His wife is awesome too.
Very great.
Never met Mr. Poofall. My choir teacher was a lot older and he smelled like coffee and cigarettes all the time. But he was very supportive and I learned a lot from him. I did not develop a crush on him. I don't know either if I had a favorite character. I think I really loved the relationship between Fish and Brett. And I loved the adventure, the way that yes, they were escaping and they were escaping intentionally, but the use of their imagination and like Jodi had said, the boat that they built and they named it and they changed the name several times depending on the circumstance. But I loved that because it brought me back to my own childhood. Being a kid in the 70s, we didn't have electronics. We had to make our own adventures, and that's what we did. So I think but yeah, I want to go back and reread it. I really loved this book. I really did. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did.
I like the author the best out of all the characters in the book. But what really stands out to me is I like the little innuendos and the creative writing. Because Jodi, you brought up about the brushing of the hair, and I really want to ask the author if he really realizes or intended to put that in there to show how you can build connections in small ways. And the significance of that brushing the hair, does he really, really realize that? How huge that was in their relationship building between Tiffany and Miranda.
Okay, now for the bear discussion. On page 170, Mama Bear rescues her cub that was being attacked by the coyotes. At the end of this scene, Fish likens the mama bear to his own mother, who he sees as strong and protective. He thought of his own, the quote, he thought of his own mother, her talk of visions and dreams. Later in the book, on page about 265, Fish has an encounter with a huge Bruin or male bear. This old venerable bear saved his life, kept him warm, protected him from the rain, and when Fish woke up in the morning, was gone. I would like each of you to explain the relationship of the old venerable bear to Fish. And I think I'm going to start with Jodi because this was your suggestion.
Well, I think every time I think about it, probably my answer would change, but I was just thinking now about nature as a character in the book. And like everyone had the external witness of trauma with the tornado, and then seeing the destruction of that the tornado left as they went back up the river. So they had this, and they were all connected with each other. Tiffany and Brad had a new relationship. So there were many things going on that they were able to witness the trauma and be regulated in that experience. So if you think about the bear within all of that, at this moment, my interpretation is the bear as faith. The faith in the mama bear's strength. The faith in the father who is not living anymore, but the bear shows up to protect him. Like the bear was the story, or the father was the story initially to get bread and fish down the river. So different aspects of faith and parental roles.
Well, yeah, so when I was reading the book, until the bear actually nudged fish into the cave point or cave, I really just saw the bear as something literal, like it's a bear and it's gonna eat them. But once I read the part about how it was nudging on him and then he got into the cave and then the bear laid down in front of the cave and he was like able to snuggle up to the bear and stuff, then I thought more like, okay, it's still a literal bear, but it's Fish's dad coming through to like protect him and utilizing the bear as a vessel. But that might be a little out there for some folks.
No, that was my theory too. Jodi and I were messaging on Zoom back and forth. I think it was his father. I do. Whether it was literal or, but I think that because they reached the point where they were close to where his father was supposed to be. And then his father, the bear arrives in that moment and protects him. But I do love the scene too with the mama bear when his Fish's reaction at the end was to shout and whoop and, and then the bear turns on them for a moment. But yeah, I loved that. Plus they call me Mama Bear. So I like the mama bear too, but.
Similar, I thought, I literally thought that it was real and that I've probably read so many stories out there, because if it's on the internet, it's true. But that there's animals out there that do things that shock us and protect people and take care of people. And at first I thought it was real, like it's a real bear. They're taking that as protecting their cub. But I also thought about the dad, using the bear as a vessel to protect his son. Yeah, very similar.
Well, does anyone in the audience have any questions?
Well, Beth is probably going to say this, but I will thank you greatly for taking time out of it. I know you're very busy schedules to do this. I'm sorry the whole county isn't here to hear this. It's kind of like a teachers conferences. The parents you most want to see never show. It's the parents of the good kids that show up, etc. I learned a lot. Here's a question for, I don't need you to answer this, but I wrote down, what does this book say about the author's understanding of trauma? And I didn't think about that while I was reading the book. I personally was not enamored with the book. Well, let me say, with the adventure in the book. I loved all the people. They were all lost souls, except Deputy Bobby or somebody. But they were all lost souls. And they're not unlost yet, but they're getting there. And so that was really great. And the thing about that brushing of the hair, I think I read and know somewhere that there's this thing like, if you're willing to touch me, I must be worth something. That is very significance of touch and all the things about being a champion. It was great. I thank you again. I have some more questions. I'll try to find them, but.
Thank you all. You all did a great job. If it's okay, I'd just like to make an observation. I graduated from college in '68, And I was a teacher and most of the time special ed teacher, ED and LD. And I was a psych minor. And so, and then I taught psychology to juniors and seniors in my last 10 years, in addition to being special ed. And I remember when I finished college with a master's, the thinking was nature versus nurture was all nurture. And then all of this brain research started happening and how that evolved and how now it's part of what you do. It's part of why this trauma happens. What is it that the changes with the cortisol or the hormone, all of that stuff. And in a sense, it gives people a reason. There was a man who had written a book when I was in college called Bruno Bettelheim, and you're too young to know probably who he was, but his whole thing was that kids who had problems and were autistic and whatever, there was no word for autistic then, but it was because their mothers were cold. So it was all this guilt. And now the whole idea that there are reasons, you know, life happens and there are reasons why these happened, and the whole guilt thing can be not
Traumatic.
erased maybe, but certainly diminished. And I just, it's wonderful to hear the kinds of things that happen, and the approach is so different. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Anybody have anything to say? Y'all talk out. I kept you busy.
I could talk forever about this topic.
Oh, we have another one.
I just wanted to say that I'm a counselor in the community and I work with inner children with my clients a lot, but I think that every one of you are superheroes in what you do, because I don't think people understand unless they're behind the scenes, which I have been, of what you do. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for all you do in our community, because it's so important. When we were talking about, you know, how can we support the children and even how can we support what you all do, it brought me to something that Brene Brown has talked about over and over, about how does the picture change if we assume that the person is doing their best. If we assume that that child is doing the best, that they can do, and we assume that the social workers and the workers are doing their best. So I think that's really important to consider for all of us in our daily life as well, with our families and, so I just wanted to bring that out.
Politics.
Yeah.
My only comment is I was first introduced to this book on WPR's Chapter a Day. And it kept me glued for the whole book. I made an effort to listen to it every day, and I was really quite shocked to see the book as the Door County reads, and I'm glad that you're participating. Each one of you said something that I've experienced in my own life. In particular, the idea of going outside your comfort zone. It's just kind of like exercise. The more your muscles can't grow if you don't stretch them. Your brain can't grow, your heart can't grow if you don't stretch them. And I don't think there's any one of us that's never not had trauma in their life of some kind. And a book like this that is rather expansive, makes you think about all of those things over time. So thank you.
Okay, one more time, a thank you to all of the panelists today. Jodi Rose Gonzales from Jodi Rose Studios. Rebecca Nicholson, Community Connector for Door County Partnership for Children and Families. Helen Bacon, League of Women Voters, thank you very much for being a good moderator for us today. Oh, Dori Goddard, Masters of Social Work, Child Protection and Youth Justice Manager for Door County HHS, and Sarah Perzycki, who I did not say also has her MSW, thank you very much, Mental Health Case Manager for Door County DHHS Comprehensive Community Services Program.